I was vacationing with my family when I received an odd message. Come back home immediately. Don't tell your parents anything. 3 hours later, I stepped off the plane and found a lawyer standing beside several police officers. 10 minutes after hearing the truth, I collapsed onto the cold airport floor. Even now, I remember the sharp smell of coffee and jet fuel hanging in the air. I remember my mother laughing beside the hotel pool only hours earlier, completely unaware. I remember the vibration of my phone when the message arrived from an unknown number. At first, I thought it was some cruel prank, but something about those words unsettled me. I lied to my parents, saying I had a work emergency, and booked the first flight home. Throughout the journey, my mind raced with possibilities. Had someone died? Was I being blackmailed? Had I done something wrong? Nothing prepared me for what awaited me. As I exited the airport terminal, I noticed a gray-haired man holding a folder with my name written across it. Beside him stood 2 uniformed police officers and another detective in plain clothes. My legs nearly gave out. "Mr. Harrison?" the older man asked quietly. I nodded. "My name is Robert Hayes. I'm your grandfather's attorney." Grandfather. My grandfather had died 20 years earlier. Before I could ask another question, one of the detectives stepped forward. "We need to discuss your parents." His words struck me like ice water. "My parents?" I repeated. The lawyer exchanged a troubled glance with the officers. "There are things they never told you," he said softly. "And after what we discovered this morning, you deserved to know immediately." He opened the folder. Inside was a photograph. A photograph that shattered my entire life, because the man and woman smiling beside me as a child weren't my parents at all, and the truth behind that lie was far worse than anything I could have imagined. Everything around me blurred, then darkness swallowed me whole when I woke up in the hospital. The lawyer, Robert Hayes, was sitting quietly beside my bed. He apologized for the shock, but I barely heard him. My thoughts kept returning to the people I had called Mom and Dad for 32 years. My name is Ethan Harrison, and until that day, I believed I had a normal life. I worked as a financial analyst, kept to myself, and avoided conflict whenever possible. Friends often joked that I was too patient for my own good. They weren't entirely wrong. Growing up, I was always treated differently from my younger brother. Ryan, he received praise for the smallest accomplishments, while my efforts were expected and rarely acknowledged. If Ryan made a mistake, excuses appeared. If I made one, lectures followed. I convinced myself that every family had favorites, and that I simply needed to work harder to earn their approval. Looking back, I realize how often I was taken for granted. Whenever my parents needed money, I was the responsible son they called. When they needed errands done, I canceled plans without complaint. Ryan, meanwhile, lived freely, spending recklessly, and relying on everyone else to clean up after him. Still, I loved them. That was the cruelest part. I had spent years trying to win affection that was always given to someone else without conditions. Deep down, I had often wondered why I never truly felt like I belonged. Certain looks, whispered conversations that stopped when I entered the room, and strange tensions during family gatherings left questions I never dared ask. That now, lying in that hospital bed, I realized those unanswered questions had been warning signs, and someone had spent decades making sure I never learned the truth. As the days passed, Robert Hayes began showing me documents that had been hidden for decades. But before revealing everything, he asked me to think carefully about my childhood, and write down anything that had ever felt unusual once. I started remembering. The memories came quietly, one after another. I remembered my 16th birthday, when my father handed Ryan the keys to a used car he had supposedly earned, while I received a watch and a reminder that I needed to focus on my studies. I smiled and thanked them anyway. I remembered college. My parents insisted there wasn't enough money to help with my tuition, so I worked nights and graduated with debt. 2 years later, they proudly paid for Ryan's business degree without hesitation. Even family photos seemed different now. My mother always stood beside Ryan, her hand resting on his shoulder. I was usually at the edge of the frame, smiling politely, as though I had wandered into someone else's picture at holiday dinners. I noticed the glances they exchanged whenever relatives mentioned how different I looked. Conversations would pause for a second too long. Then someone would quickly change the subject. There were other moments too. Whenever I asked questions about my grandparents, my father became strangely quiet. My mother would force a smile and say, "Some things don't matter, Ethan." Back then, I accepted those answers. I always accepted everything, because I believed love required patience. But sitting across from Robert Hayes, and staring at old records spread across his desk, I began to understand something painful. Those small disappointments had never been accidents. For years, I had mistaken distance for normalcy, and someone had been carefully making sure I remained an outsider in the only family I had ever known. 3 days later, Robert Hayes finally told me the truth. I had not been adopted. I had been taken 32 years earlier. After my biological parents died in a car accident, my father's younger brother and his wife had become my legal guardians. My grandfather had created a trust fund and left detailed instructions that the money was to remain untouched until I turned 35. But someone had been stealing from it for years. Quietly, carefully, and according to the investigators, most of the money had been spent on Ryan. As Robert laid the financial records across his desk, I felt something inside me change. Not anger, not hatred, clarity. For years, I had blamed myself for not being good enough. I had chased approval that was never mine to earn. The people I had sacrificed for had never seen me as a son. I stared at the signatures on the documents. My father's handwriting, my mother's approval, thousands upon thousands of dollars, and suddenly, I understood why the police had been waiting at the airport. This wasn't a family misunderstanding, it was a crime. For the first time in my life, I stopped wondering how to protect them. Instead, I quietly made a decision. I would tell the truth. Every document, every lie, every stolen dollar, and this time, I would let the consequences belong to them. I didn't confront them. That surprised even Robert Hayes. Most people, he said, demanded answers immediately. Some shouted. Others threatened lawsuits before understanding the full picture. I did neither. After 12 years as a financial analyst, I had learned that numbers rarely lied. Emotions clouded judgment. Records didn't. So I focused on facts. Robert introduced me to a forensic accountant and an experienced prosecutor assigned to the investigation. Together, we reviewed decades of bank statements, trust documents, property records, and tax filings. Every transfer was traced. Every signature was examined. The pattern was undeniable. Money intended for my future had funded Ryan's education, his failed businesses, luxury vacations, and even the down payment on his house. Meanwhile, I had worked overtime, paid my own debts, and believed I simply hadn't earned the same support. I remained silent. When my parents called from vacation, I answered normally. I listened to my mother complain about hotel service, and my father laugh about some expensive dinner they had enjoyed. Neither suspected that investigators had already frozen several accounts. Neither knew that copies of every document were safely stored with my attorney. I wasn't interested in revenge born from anger. I wanted something far more permanent. I wanted the truth to speak for itself, and I intended to give it all the time it needed. 2 weeks later, my parents returned from vacation. I didn't meet them. Instead, I sat quietly beside Robert Hayes in a conference room overlooking the city. Rain tapped softly against the windows as investigators organized files and photographs across the polished table. At exactly 10 a.m., my father and mother walked in. They froze when they saw me. Then they noticed the detectives. Then the documents. My mother turned pale. My father tried to smile. "Ethan, what is all this?" he asked, forcing a laugh that quickly died in the silence. I said nothing. I simply slid a copy of my grandfather's trust agreement across the table. For the first time in my life, my father had no explanation ready. The room remained still except for the sound of rain and the rustling of papers. Then one investigator calmly outlined the evidence, transfer after transfer, signature after signature, date after date. My mother quietly began to cry. My father lowered his eyes, neither looked at me, neither denied anything, and Ryan, who had arrived 30 minutes later expecting another family discussion, sat speechless. When he learned the house he proudly called his own had been purchased with stolen money, no shouting followed. No dramatic accusations, just silence. The same silence I had lived with for 32 years, only now it belonged to them. The consequences unfolded slowly, just as the truth itself had. Within months, criminal charges were filed. Several assets were seized, and the house Ryan had always bragged about was ordered sold. Friends who had admired my parents' comfortable lifestyle suddenly kept their distance. Relatives who had once dismissed my concerns began calling, offering apologies they should have made years earlier. Ryan visited me only once. He sat across from me in a quiet cafe, his eyes fixed on the untouched coffee between us. For the first time in his life, he looked uncertain. "I didn't know," he whispered. Maybe he was telling the truth. Maybe he wasn't by then. It no longer mattered. What mattered was that I had finally stopped measuring my worth by the affection of people who had built their lives on deception, that their reputation suffered. Their secrets became public. But the greatest change happened inside me. I no longer felt like the forgotten son desperately trying to earn a place at the table. I understood that blood alone does not make a family, and sacrifice does not guarantee love. That's why this story matters, that because sometimes the deepest wounds don't come from enemies, they come from the people we spend years trying to please. And sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't destruction, it's refusing to carry someone else's guilt any longer. A year later, my life looked nothing like it had before. The legal proceedings were over. My grandfather's remaining assets had finally been restored to me. But strangely, that wasn't what brought me peace. For the first time since childhood, I no longer woke up wondering how to earn someone's approval. I had stopped chasing love from people who had never intended to give it. Instead, I began building a life that belonged to me. I left my old apartment and moved closer to the coast. I worked less and lived more. I traveled. I reconnected with cousins who had quietly drifted away over the years. And I learned that family could be found in honesty, not just in blood. As for my parents, I never wished them harm. The truth had done enough, and Ryan, I eventually forgave him, not because he deserved it, but because I deserved peace. Sometimes, I still think about that message I received on vacation. Come back home immediately. Don't tell your parents anything. At the time, I thought those words marked the end of my life. I was wrong. They marked the end of a lie. Because losing the people I thought I needed gave me something far more valuable. It gave me myself, and I finally understood that the most painful truths don't destroy us. They introduce us to the person we were always meant to become.